Welcome to Honcho on the Air, a podcast that brings you to the latest talks and the latest trends in business, technology, innovation, the candid side of C-level executives. Each week on this season, we explore topics and issues on post-pandemic digital transformation, recovery plan, digital economy, transformational technologies, data analytics and AI, and many more.
Honcho on the Air second season is sponsored by Tier 1 Entertainment. Truly top tier. Like what you hear so far. Make sure you never miss the show by clicking the follow button now. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. Now back to the show.
Our guest today is a good buddy of mine, Earl Valencia. He is the co-founder of Plentina, an AI and fintech startup that helps retailers in emerging markets offer their customers an ability to pay with credit even without a credit card. He is previously co-founder of QBO, the National Innovation Center in the Philippines, and IdeaSpace Foundation. For his contribution to Philippine innovation, he was awarded by the President of the Philippines as one of the 10 outstanding young men and women of the country. He's going to share with us transformational technologies for a transforming society. Hi, Earl. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, of course. No, thank you for that introduction. Always good to hear from you, Angela. We go way back and, in many different, shapes or forms of our careers. And I'm glad that you're here now contributing a lot to the Philippine economy and the regional economy as well. So thanks for having me.
Maybe share a little bit more about your background as well as the organization and things that creating impact in both first world and hindi ko masabi na third world eh.
The emerging economies, right?
Emerging economies, para mas sexy.
I mean,
right?
my passion really is kind of the intersection of technology and impacting emerging economies, right? Like that's really what my ethos is since I was young. So just really quick, I grew up in Manila most of my life, and I had this dream when I was very young to become, maybe an astronaut. But in the Philippines, I didn't really, I thought it was somewhat of an impossible dream. And ended up going to UP, and then, I had this kind of lingering feeling that maybe, I had to go leave the Philippines to, pursue that career. Ended up becoming an aerospace engineer. So I worked on the things that I dreamt about actually was, drones, rockets, satellites, all these things. And then I kind of had this realization that, how can I use this technology background in order to create more impact in emerging markets? And ended up going to Silicon Valley kind of by chance. I got into Stanford's business school, where ironically, actually, I met my co-founder for Plentina. So, it was kind of nice. It's a bonus that, Kevin was in the machine learning PhD while I was in business school. And we were co-presidents of the Stanford Graduate Student Association for Filipinos. So there was like less than 10 Filipinos in the entire Stanford graduate school. And during the time, we kind of had these reflections all the time, right? Like, we're so privileged inside of Silicon Valley, in Stanford in particular. Like, how do we use our networks and our knowledge to make an impact, especially in the Philippines? We didn't know what the story was going to be, but we always had this lingering thought in our mind. So obviously, I ended up going to, more of kind of the BD and tech side. So I was in Cisco's emerging technology team. I was focused on emerging markets. At the time, it was Brazil, Russia, India, China. I called the BRIC countries. So I was covering the BRIC countries for the incubator. But ran kind of innovation globally. And then since I was focused on emerging markets, guess what happens? You get asked by a big customer to kind of run innovation for them, which was PLDT and Smart for me, right? So I was literally giving a talk, and their HR head said, you should come back to the Philippines. And I was like, no, I'm not going to come back to the Philippines. But when I met my former boss, and at the time was just kind of an informal chat with Manny Pangalinan, who's the chairman of PLDT and the CEO for Specific, he basically had the same alignment and mission as me, right? He kept on asking me, like, what do you want to do in life and what do you want to do for the Philippines? And I had this bold vision of building Silicon Valley of the Philippines, right? In early 2010 or so, like, it's not like now where there's startups, there's Kubo, right? IdeaSpace, incubators, venture capital funds, like there's nothing, right? Like if you had an idea, sometimes you pitch to investors and investors will get 90% of the business because they have the money, right? And that was the culture of investment at the time. And, a lot of times, they'll have, research, let's say from universities, but after that, it just dies, right? And then you have regional funds or US funds trying to invest, but they only will invest in like highly profitable proven business models at like the series C or later. So you have this huge gap of people that kind of have this creativity but then never really got that out. So we were pretty lucky that I ended up pitching, like everyone startup, right? Pitching this idea of building an accelerator in the Philippines, which ended up becoming IdeaSpace. And our seed capital was, I think, at that time, $12 million, which was pretty big for the ecosystem. Now it seems small, but it was the biggest, I guess, investment in startups in history of the Philippines by a private sector during that time. So that was nice. We literally seeded the ecosystem. We ran, we were part of hundreds of events per year. There was one year that I think I either sponsored, spoke, or participated in 90% of all startup events in the Philippines, right? That's just how we rolled, right? So because we were trying to build it, right? Like that's like the building phase. That's why Kubo was born, which is the government and all these things, and eventually, after 4 years, I had this weird epiphany of like, I think I was still there's still something missing in kind of my experience. And that missing part was data and digital transformation, right? Like I kind of knew innovation, but I saw that there was this thing on the horizon, which is at some point, like, how do we use data in order to kind of create and make kind of decisions and build enterprises, right? And I didn't know so much about it. So ended up talking to the person that hired me, which is MVP, and said like, what do you think I should do? And he basically said, yeah, you know what, like you should go learn and come back, right? So that was like his challenge for me, is like, the one thing that I just believe in you, Earl, is that you will never abandon the Philippines, right? Like even if you leave, you will find a way to come back. And I ended up coming to Wall Street actually. So I was lucky that I got recruited by a big hedge fund in Wall Street. It's the largest hedge fund in the world, called Bridgewater. And then I was in the headquarters of Charles Schwab, which is one of the biggest investment brokerage houses in the world. And I was in both their data and digital transformation teams. And I realized very quickly is that how can you bring that level of sophistication to the financial sector in the Philippines? And that was the siren call, right, to go back to the Philippines and do something there. And I'm lucky that destiny has it that that friend of mine, my co-president 10 years ago with the Filipino graduate student associate at Stanford, said, I'm going to quit Google. He was in the machine learning AI team of Google, and he said, I want to do something in financial services. I wanted to combine ideas and build something for the Philippines, and that's how Plentina was born. And in a nutshell, we kind of use AI and data in order to feed decisions, in order for us to give access to credit to the 90% of people in the Philippines that don't have access to credit cards, right? So we partner with large merchants, and now we have like a large, to be honest, I'm very proud of our partnership team because, we have the likes of 7-Eleven, Smart PLDT. We did a pilot with AirAsia. We just launched with Philippine Airlines, right? Like we have Pure Gold there. We have like basically some of the top brands, National Bookstore, something that's close to my heart. Then we just launched with the big e-commerce players like Lazada, Store, right? So we have some of the biggest brands in the Philippines now using Plentina. And we're just less than 1 year old in the Philippines, right? So it's pretty amazing. But it really started with that idea of like, how do we really create a world-class technology company that's based out of data and partnerships that's really focused on the Philippines. And I think we have it there. And we're lucky that we also have venture capitalists that believe in what we're talking about, right? So that's the biggest things.
Okay, and in terms of the business or your team here in the Philippines, um, do they share same vision, or how big is your team here? Uh,
Yeah, we're
you
close to
roll out.
20. We're about 20 people in the Philippines. We've also a couple of people in Vietnam. Me and my co-founder are kind of based in the US, but our intention is we always would have been back in Asia. We work Asia hours, right? So every day. So my work unfortunately is like, in call center language, double shift, right? Like I have the US shift and I have in the Philippine shift, like literally in one day. So I work, I don't know, 16-hour days, right? Um, but but yeah, I think in the Philippines and actually in Vietnam too, but everybody that we hire, like our key really is we hire for mission alignment, right?
Yeah,
Like they really have to believe that we can make a dent in this financial ecosystem in the Philippines, right? Like, a real story here, right? Like, I was in my first week in the Philippines. So I thought I was like pretty awesome, right? Like I was the youngest vice president in the entire Philippines, right? Basically a top 10 company, right? So obviously you have COOs, like child of owners, right? So they can be vice president anytime, but I was like a professional. So I was like 28, 29, right? And I was, corporate vice president of a top 5 company. So I go to a bank and said, hey, can I get a credit card? Like I just arrived from Silicon Valley. I wrote up my application form, and guess what happened? They said denied. I was like, this doesn't make sense, right? I had to appeal. Right? That like, I think I deserve a credit card. Make, I'm this executive, and I think that we just have a kind of a culture, I guess, of mistrust,
yeah,
right? So the financial system in general don't trust people, right? So how do we kind of change that paradigm of like, using data in order to quantify trust, right?
yeah,
To people, and based on your potential rather than your assets, right? Because we're also a culture because of lack of trust. Like it's like we only believe in assets, right? So what happens if you don't have assets,
you don't have
right?
assets.
Then you don't get financial services, right?
Yeah.
So or you
Well,
go to informal financial services like 5, 6 lenders, right? So
yeah.
so that's kind of what happened. So we said, how do we just make this kind of systemic change, right? So Plentina is just a vehicle for systemic change, right?
Right.
And we believe that everybody that comes to Plentina believes in this kind of theory of change that we're trying to do,
Yeah.
and hopefully we're going to be successful in this. But we're pretty excited with the momentum we have, at least in the first year, right? So
Honcho on the Air second season is sponsored by Globe Labs. Redefine possibilities. Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss the show by clicking the follow button now. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. Now back to the show.
What do you think is the missing link?
yeah, I think it's this, right? Like I think I was talking to one of our key investors the other day, and he said that unfortunately in Asia, business is very relational. But because of that, they don't invest so much in engineering, product, and data, right? So there's very few real technology companies in Asia, even if they're a tech startup, right? What more large companies, right? So
Yeah.
he said that, how do you bring in this like tech culture, tech first culture, data first culture as you build out this company? And that's something that's kind of a reminder that we always have to lean on that, right? I think if we do that, then we can unlock so many more things, right? Like imagine if we build new age credit models, if we build new ways to actually interact with the merchants and customers, do things really fast. Like for us, like from download to taking out a loan, it's 5 to 10 minutes without any paper,
Yeah.
right? Like it's just something that we we opt to have. But we think like, oh, that's just normal, but it becomes magical to customers, right? So that's the type of thinking we have. And obviously, at some point, we want not from 5 minutes, right, into like seconds, right? Maybe that could happen in the next year or two, but we just have to continuously improve using technology and data. And I think that's our edge. And hopefully, more enterprises really lean into this, because this is what we need post pandemic, right? It's like a digitally transformed economy, right?
Yeah.
And without that, then we're pretty much going to be lagging, right? So I really
Yeah.
hope we transform the economy with this. So
Yeah. And then I think just an add on also. Um, yeah, technology is really the one will change every single aspect of, of of industries. But at the same time, um, would be ideal to have both sides, from the consumers and from the side of
yeah, it's funny. The consumers, they like it, right? Like it's funny. I think the Philippines is the most. We're so used to consuming technology, and especially digital and mobile technology. Like we're so used to that. Is that we like it more on the social side, right?
yeah, for
But not
sure.
necessarily to business, finance, right? All these
Yeah,
things. We just don't push industry to that standard, right? But then
yeah,
social standard, it's very high, right? So I think at some point, if you just imagine that if it's as easy as like doing an Instagram story to like do things in your bank account, like that'd be magic, right?
yeah,
The other transformation that I'm super excited about is kind of this shift in digital leadership, is what I call, right?
yeah,
Like leaders that are coming into like executive roles or founder roles or whatnot that actually are I would say born digital, but they basically are very comfortable with like digital technology. And I think I'm super excited by this, right? There's going to be this big shift of leadership that will happen post pandemic, that will hopefully transform this country and the region, right, in the next five
yeah,
to 10 years.
yeah. And what I see, and maybe sharing what I've seen here in the Philippines, the
Yeah,
missing pieces maybe it's here in the Philippines,
yeah, right.
right?
So for sure, for sure.
And knowing the how strong Plantina is, looking back, do you think how did it differ being a leader in a pre and post pandemic in the fintech industry, and what are the major challenges you have faced, and how did you overcome it?
Again, we can't say post pandemic what's going to happen post
Ah,
pandemic.
yeah, yeah,
I'm
yeah,
not
yeah,
sure,
yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I
Maybe
think,
some theories, right?
yeah,
Maybe
yeah, yeah,
for
yeah. So for sure, right? I think so. My prediction or my theory, right? And again, this is Earl Valencia's theory, is that um, the expectation of the customer is just much higher with regards to every part of your life, right?
just
So from a digital perspective, right? So um, you know, someone's gonna say, why isn't e-commerce as easy as And the thing is, we're benchmarking now globally, which is kind of a we can't hide anymore and say this is just a Philippine standard, right? No, that's something to say. Like, and people say global standard, but actually now people are really comparing, right? Like, I heard from my aunt in the US that Amazon does this. Like, why can't it happen in the Philippines, right? Like, I heard from my uncle in San Francisco that if they trade stocks, they can do it all from their phone, right? Like, the benchmark of like what is standard is
yeah,
just much much higher now because the world is so interconnected digitally, right? So we can't just say like, oh, because we're Philippines, we're like developing economy, like our customers deserve less because you know I don't know, right? Like we're more of an emerging economy. Like, no, right? Even if you're in Africa or in the Philippines or
exactly.
in China or in the US, like your standard, this especially this next generation standard, I don't want to say, right? Like the Gen Z, right? Millennial generation, like their standard is global. So I
Yeah,
think that's what's going to happen. So for us, that's what we're obviously aspiring to do, right? Is to have a global standard application, even if it's focused solely in the Philippines for now. Um, And the challenges really during the pandemic is, how do we build out a culture that is born digital, right? Like we hired people that we never met physically. We don't physically have an office. Right now, I have people, people in, South America, but they're Filipino. They just got stuck there. Someone in London got stuck there. Obviously, I'm stuck in the US. So it's like we just adjust ourselves, right, in order to do this and have a culture that is still strong, even
Yeah.
if you don't have the physical interaction, right? I think that's the challenge. And then obviously, telling a Philippine growth story and recovery story is something also that was pretty challenging in the beginning, right? Because especially we were, fundraising during COVID time. It's just always hard, right? Like, so will we recover, not recover? How's the Philippines, etc. And that was somewhat of a challenge, but we kind of pulled through just by sheer execution, obviously a little bit of luck and inspiration, right? So I think that's really the key is one thing I realized through my startup journey is that um, it's always beneficial to go to people that believe in you, right, and your idea. So there's always going to be like 1,000 people that say no to your aspiration, dream, goals, etc. But there's going to be people that actually maybe care about what you're doing or understand what you're doing and take a bet on people because of what they want to do, right? So yeah, I'd rather get money. So that's funny. I'd rather get investors that believe in what I'm trying to do versus pushing myself to investors that really don't want, right? Like you have to
That's true.
convince them cerebrally that
That's true.
your type of industry, your type of opportunity makes sense for them. But
Yeah.
that's hard, right? So we have a great set of people that invested in Plentina that actually believe in this emerging market story, right? And that's the type. So I'd rather get money from them. I mean, they might not be like people. People always say like, "Oh, get to the top funds and all these things." And I think the top funds will come in the end if you actually do very well and your first set of investors believe in you, right? I think that's like the best thing that came to us during the pandemic and a big realization to me as a leader, right? So
And then your key person, meaning in the event, because what I noticed also in different industry now, they're moving into succession planning.
yeah, for sure, right? And I think that's also something that I always tell myself, right? Like, how do you build a organization that will work even without you? And I think it takes a little bit of maturity, to be honest, to always think this way, right? So, for example, for me, I mean, in the past, you know, 4 or 5 months, I built basically a three-person full-time partnership team, right? And they basically run like an engine, right? Obviously I guide them, etc. But they just, I mean, we have like hundreds of merchants in the pipeline now, right? In a
Mm.
span of a few months because they basically like ran by themselves, right? But then it's for us as leaders to build the processes, the environment, the guidance for them to unlock their potential, right? And I think that's the kind of the leadership that we need now is kind of empowerment and
Mm.
building kind of the structure versus you dipping into the because especially it's digital now, right? Like you
Yeah,
don't also it's number one, it's hard to micromanage. Number two, it really your people will really feel if you're micromanaging them digitally,
that's true. That's true.
right? Like before you can just like you want to micromanage, you want to just like step into their office, hey, how is it going, right? Kind of do these subtle things like maybe me as a younger manager when I was in my 20s, like I would have done that, just roaming around, like in the end of the day, like just walking around the floor, like you kind of do these things. And now like you can't just show up in a Zoom meeting and say, hey, what's going on, right? Or like
Yeah,
ping them right away in like a messenger like a Slack or something, and hey, can we do like a one-on-one right away at the end of the day? Like, no, you cannot. Like it's purely trust.
yeah,
So you need to have this environment and also processes that people run by themselves and do things independently without you there. So
that's
it's
true.
it's a it's a real different leadership, right? It's a
Yeah.
leadership paradigm. So
We believe in mentorship.
yeah, of course. I mean, I need mentors People need mentors. But for me, if I mentor people, it's all about like just trying to discover like where they want to be, right? In the fundamental sense of their own being, right? I think that's the biggest thing. So even for me, like I always seek out mentors of people that I aspire to be, right?
Yeah.
And just ask them questions and like, and especially if I'm comfortable being kind of vulnerable and dumb around them, right? Right? Because the worst thing in a mentoring relationship is like if you're not vulnerable and if you're not telling people like the real dirt, right? Like for me, I can tell, some of my mentors, right? Like I have no clue what I'm doing,
Yeah.
right? Like I can say that, like, and I'd love that relationship kind of is just deeper, right? And it's more meaningful. And if people who I mentor, right, like basically like they also tell that like I have no clue what I'm doing, but these are the things that I'm looking for. Like that's a richer conversation than like pretending that they know what you're doing, right? Because
Yeah.
it's difficult, right? Like
Yeah.
it's like so iterative,
I agree. I agree. And sometimes mentors and elders is they are the one who actually understand the real you, right? And
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you're and that's why hard to maybe the mindset is different, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah. No, that's true. That's true, right? So I think they, in the end, right? Like, it's like in a company, you have a board of advisors or board of directors. I think as a person, you also need that, right? That's my
ah
philosophy, right? Like you have someone there as like, you have asked for advice related to, I don't know, finances, right? Then you have a mentor that relates to like relationships, right?
correct.
And a mentor that relates to professional, right? Or maybe someone's for startup, one's in corporate, right? I think those are the types of things that you need to build as a professional, because life is so dynamic, right? Like
Yeah.
sometimes you have a problem with relationships, sometimes you have a problem with startups,
Yeah,
sometimes you need to understand the psychology of a corporate executive, right? Like all these things are so dynamic, you need to have people around you, right? So
that's true. I agree. Last one. Last question, Earl. Transformation isn't just about changing the system. It's usually about building on top of a solid foundation. As a leader, how will you communicate your tradition as a springboard to the future?
yeah, this is something that people are so I always tell people like digital transformation is the buzzword of the century, right?
Yeah.
And it's a buzzword. Why? Because good organizations, and to be honest, even you as an individual, right? Like you have to transform yourself, to be honest, at a minimum every 10 years,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Successful organizations and successful people, like professionals, have to transform yourself every 10 years. And because the world is changing even
Mm,
faster than that, right? Like, if you imagine the world 10 years ago, like what Facebook was a startup, right? Now it's obviously huge, so the world is changing so rapidly that if you're not conscious about it, but talk about traditions, right? And ethos,
yeah.
right? I mean, I always tell organizations, and I teach at AIM now, but I always tell organizations that you have to come back to why the company was started,
That's true.
right? And there's a founding story for every company,
I
right? even
agree.
if it's even if it's like whatever 300 years old, like Ayala Corp or something like that. I don't know how old they are, right? But hundreds of years versus even PLDT, who's like almost 100 years old, to a startup like us, which is like a year old, right? A year or 2 years old. So every company has a founding story, but
Yeah.
the longer you are, people forget, right? But the way that you transform is to come back to that and kind of reignite the founding story of the organization, because you will then realize why you're created and why you need to transform.
That's
Because most likely you were a challenger before,
yeah.
right? It's just
For
that
sure.
people forget I'm a big company, I'm stable. That's the best thing in the Philippines. Love, like I'm stable. I'm gonna go to a stable company, but people forget that they started as a startup. Every company starts like a
Yeah.
startup,
Yeah.
right? So I always look at like I always ask, do you know why your company was started? And most people don't know. so that's for me the foundation of every transformation is to come back to the roots, build up again the challenger mentality, and then kind of go from there and use digital as a tool, but not as the end all and be all, right?
What is your maybe any closing statement for our audience, or on of what do you think will be the growth story the next 12 to 18 months of Plentina?
Yeah, so I mean, I think for Plentina, we were built for a reason, right? And the reason is our mission, right? And the mission is for us to democratize financial services for the billions in emerging markets, right? So, for us, how do we just continue in that path, right? And we using data and technology to do that, right? But my final thoughts really here is, I think if you are, we need more people to lead, right? Post pandemic, there's so much thing that needs to be done during the recovery after all of this is said and done, right? And we need this. I keep on mentioning, like, what is the next generation of digital leaders that will build up the Philippines, build up emerging economies, build up the world, because this is where leaders did the most, right? So that's the challenge I have for everyone listening, and I hope that you sign up to the battlefield.
Thank you for joining us this week on Honcho on the Air. Make sure to visit our website at asianhr.org, where you can subscribe to the show in Spotify so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, make sure to like and subscribe to our social media pages to get the latest news and updates. Maraming salamat po.